Bear carries her injured cub to a fisherman. His next move will leave you stunned. The sun had just begun to crest over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the serene river in rural Montana. The stillness of the morning was broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft babble of water cascading over smooth stones. Birds chirped in the distance, their melodies blending harmoniously with the peaceful sounds of the wilderness. John, a man in his late 40s, stood knee-deep in the water, his fishing rod poised. He was a man seeking solace, retreating to nature's embrace after a recent devastating loss. The river was his sanctuary, a place where he could think, grieve, and breathe in the crisp, unspoiled air. The forest loomed behind him, tall pines swaying gently in the breeze, their shadows dancing on the rippling water. As he cast his line, his mind wandered. He had always believed nature held its mysteries, its quiet lessons. He often wondered if it was trying to communicate with those who took the time to listen. But that morning, John was about to learn that nature's messages could come in the most unexpected ways. Suddenly, the tranquility shattered. A rustling noise in the underbrush behind him made John freeze. His pulse quickened as the sound grew, louder, more deliberate. He turned slowly, his breath hitching when he saw the source. A massive bear emerged from the tree line, her brown fur gleaming in the soft dawn light. But this was no ordinary encounter. Clutched in her powerful jaws was a cub, limp and motionless, its tiny body smeared with blood. The mother bear moved deliberately, her every step laden with a desperation that struck John to his core. His fishing rod slipped from his hands and splashed into the water, but he barely noticed. His instincts screamed at him to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the formidable creature. Yet something in her eyes stopped him. There was no aggression, no menace, only a pleading sorrow that he could feel in his bones. The bear lumbered closer, her movements labored, her gaze locked with John's, a silent connection forming between man and beast. Then, as if making a decision, she carefully placed the cub on the riverbank and stepped back, her eyes never leaving him. John stood frozen, his heart pounding like a drum. He had no idea what to do or what the bear expected of him, and yet, in that moment, he knew this encounter would change him forever. John's breath came in shallow bursts as he stared at the bear and her injured cub. His hands trembled, a mixture of fear and confusion coursing through him. Every fiber of his being told him to back away slowly, to avoid any sudden movement that might provoke the mother bear. But he remained rooted in place, his gaze locked with hers. The river whispered against the rocks, the sound stark against the pounding of his heart. Slowly, John's eyes drifted to the cub. Its tiny body was motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. Blood streaked its fur, a deep gash visible on its side. It wasn't just hurt, it was dying. And the mother bear knew it. The bear let out a low rumble, not a growl of aggression, but something softer, almost mournful. She took another step back, as if to give him space, her head tilted slightly. It was then John noticed something remarkable. She wasn't acting like a wild animal defending her young. She was asking for help. His mind raced. What could he do? What should he do? The primal part of him screamed that approaching the cub was madness, that no amount of calm demeanor could fully predict how a bear might react. But then he thought of the desperation in her eyes, the sheer vulnerability of her gesture. This wasn't an ordinary encounter. It was something deeper, something unspoken. John's instincts and empathy battled furiously. He had no medical supplies, no tools, and yet the bear had come to him. Why him? He had no answers, only the undeniable truth that he was the cub's only chance. Taking a deep breath, John spoke softly, more to himself than to the bear. Okay. Let's see what we can do." He took a tentative step forward, his boots squelching in the damp earth. The mother bear tensed but didn't move, her watchful eyes fixed on his every motion. He kept his hands visible, his posture low, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. With each step closer to the cub, the air grew heavier, charged with tension and trust in equal measure. Finally, he crouched beside the small, injured creature. Up close, the cub looked even more fragile. Its fur was matted and its breathing was faint. John swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over the wound. He tore off the sleeve of his flannel shirt, his hands shaking as he pressed the fabric gently against the cub's side to stem the bleeding. "It's okay, little guy," he murmured, though his voice wavered. He glanced up at the mother bear who stood a few feet away, watching him intently. Her body was rigid, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was trusting him, and he couldn't afford to fail her. As he worked, time seemed to blur. The forest fell silent, as if the world itself held its breath. John did his best to clean and bind the wound, his makeshift bandage crude but sufficient to stop the bleeding. He could feel the mother bear's gaze on him the entire time, an unspoken dialogue passing between them. When he finally sat back, the cub let out a weak whimper, its tiny body twitching. Relief flooded John's chest. It wasn't much, but it was alive. He turned his gaze to the mother bear and spoke softly. "There. I've done what I can. It's up to you now." The bear took a step forward, her enormous frame casting a shadow over him. John's muscles tightened instinctively, but he didn't move. She sniffed the air, her nose twitching, before lowering her head to nudge the cub. Her touch was impossibly gentle, her rough tongue licking the cub's fur as if to soothe it. John's heart swelled at the sight. It was a moment so raw, so profoundly tender, that it brought a lump to his throat. He hadn't expected this, any of it. And yet he felt a strange sense of peace as he watched the bear care for her young. But the moment wasn't over. The mother bear turned her gaze back to John, her eyes holding a depth he couldn't explain. It wasn't gratitude in the human sense, but something primal and eternal, a bond forged in trust and necessity. And then she let out a low rumble, a sound that sent chills down his spine. Was it a warning, or something else entirely? The bear's low rumble hung in the air, reverberating through the stillness of the forest. John froze, unsure if it was a sound of approval, warning, or something in between. He remained crouched on the ground, his hands resting on his knees, every muscle in his body braced for what might come next. The mother bear nudged her cub again, her massive paw gently brushing against its tiny frame. The cub stirred weakly, letting out a faint, high-pitched whimper. Relief coursed through John. The little one wasn't out of danger, but it was alive and responding. John's eyes flicked back to the mother bear. Her gaze hadn't wavered, her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Slowly, she straightened to her full height, towering over him. He could see every ripple of muscle beneath her thick fur, the sheer power she possessed. Yet she didn't move toward him, nor did she retreat. She simply stood there, watching. John took a slow, steady breath. "You're welcome," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the river. He didn't know if she could understand him, but somehow speaking felt necessary. The bear tilted her head slightly, her ears twitching at his words. She seemed to hesitate, as though weighing a decision. Then, to John's astonishment, she lowered herself back down onto all fours and turned her attention to the cub. With incredible care, she grasped the little one by the scruff of its neck and lifted it off the ground. John's heart thudded in his chest as he watched her. The cub hung limp in her jaws, its small body swaying slightly as she turned back toward the forest. It seemed the encounter was over. She had gotten what she needed, and now she would leave. But then she stopped. The bear turned her head, her dark eyes finding John's once more. There was something in her expression, something profound and almost haunting. She lingered for a long moment, the silence between them thick with unspoken understanding. John felt his throat tighten, emotions welling up in him that he couldn't quite name. And then, as if satisfied, the bear lumbered back into the shadows of the forest, her cub still held carefully in her jaws. She moved with a deliberate slowness, her massive form disappearing into the trees until all that remained was the soft rustling of branches and the distant chirp of birds. John stayed where he was, his knees planted in the dirt, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The forest seemed to exhale, the tension lifting as the bear's presence faded into the distance. The river resumed its gentle murmur, the world slowly returning to its usual rhythm. But for John, everything had changed. He sat back on his heels, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. The enormity of what had just transpired hit him like a wave, leaving him breathless. A mother bear had trusted him, a human, with her injured cub. She had allowed him into her world, even, if only for a moment. John stared at the spot where the bear had stood, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite define. Awe, perhaps, or maybe something deeper, a connection to the raw, untamed beauty of the natural world. Whatever it was, he knew he would never see nature the same way again. John remained on the riverbank, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him like the very air had thickened. His heart still raced, but now it wasn't fear, it was the rush of having witnessed something extraordinary. He leaned back on his hands, staring at the tree line where the bear and her cub had vanished. The forest felt alive in a way he'd never noticed before, as if every rustle, chirp and whisper carried a message just out of reach. He picked up his fishing rod, its handle still wet from where he'd dropped it, but he had no intention of casting his line again. His focus was elsewhere, his mind replaying the events in vivid detail. He couldn't shake the look in the bear's eyes, the silent understanding that had passed between them. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a communication that transcended words, species, and fear. Still, questions nagged at him. Was the cub going to survive? Had he done enough? He looked down at his hands, now streaked with dirt and a faint smear of blood. He didn't even know if his crude bandage would hold, or if it would make a difference at all. And yet, there had been no hesitation in the mother bear when she carried her cub away. She had trusted him, even if only for that fleeting moment. John stood, brushing off his pants. The river glistened in the morning sun, its surface sparkling like scattered diamonds. But the peace he once found here had been replaced with an urgency he couldn't ignore. He couldn't leave it at that, not without knowing what had become of them. Against every rational thought he made up his mind. He would follow her. His boots sank into the soft soil as he stepped toward the forest. Every instinct screamed that this was reckless. Tracking a bear, especially one with an injured cub, was not just dangerous, it bordered on suicidal. But something deeper called to him, a pull he couldn't resist. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a need to ensure they were safe. He had been pulled into their story, and now he couldn't walk away. The underbrush was thick, branches snagging at his clothes as he moved carefully through the trees. The forest was a maze of towering pines and dense foliage, each shadow a potential hiding place for danger. He strained his ears for any sign of the bear, a rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, but the woods remained eerily silent. As he climbed a small incline, he stopped abruptly. There, in the soft earth, was a fresh paw print, enormous and unmistakable. Beside it, smaller prints marked where the cub had been. John crouched down, running his fingers lightly over the impression. They were heading deeper into the woods, away from the river and toward the dense heart of the forest. He pressed on, moving as quietly as he could. His heart pounded in his chest, each step a mixture of determination and trepidation. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patches, the air heavy with the scent of pine and moss, and then he heard it, a low guttural sound, faint but distinct. His breath caught as he froze in place, scanning the shadows ahead. It was the mother bear, her voice carrying a tone of distress. John's pulse quickened as he crept closer, his movements deliberate and slow. Finally, he saw them. The bear was in a small clearing. The cub nestled at her side. She was licking the little one's wound, her massive body curled protectively around it. The cub let out a faint whimper, but didn't move much, its energy clearly depleted. John stayed at the edge of the clearing, his presence concealed by the thick brush. His heart ached as he watched her. The tenderness in her actions was unmistakable, a mother's love in its purest form. Yet the cub's condition was worsening. It was clear even from a distance. The bandage he had applied was slipping, the wound seeping blood once more. John knew the odds were against the cub's survival without proper care. He glanced around, his mind racing. Could he do more? Should he? The bear had trusted him once, but approaching her now, here in her territory, was a different matter entirely. And yet, as he stood there, he realized he couldn't walk away. John took a deep breath, steeling himself. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, each step crunching lightly on the forest floor. The bear's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto him instantly. She let out a warning growl, low and throaty, her massive body rising to shield her cub. John raised his hands, palms open in a gesture of peace. "Easy," he said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "I just want to help." The bear didn't move, her growl deepening. John stayed where he was, letting her process his presence. Her ears flicked, her gaze flickering between him and the cub. He could see the hesitation in her posture, the same conflict she had shown earlier at the river, and then, to his astonishment, she stepped aside. John's breath hitched. She didn't retreat completely, but she gave him just enough space to approach. His steps were slow, careful, his every movement calculated to avoid startling her. When he reached the cub, he knelt down, his hands trembling as he adjusted the makeshift bandage. He worked quickly, aware of the massive bear hovering, just a few feet away. The cub stirred weakly, letting out a faint sound. "Hang in there, little one," John murmured, his voice soft and soothing. He tightened the fabric, ensuring the wound was secure, and pressed lightly to stem the bleeding. His hands worked with surprising steadiness, his fear overshadowed by his focus. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, his eyes meeting the mother bear's once more. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression inscrutable, and then, with a low, rumbling sound, she settled back down beside her cub. John exhaled deeply, his chest tight with relief. He had done what he could, again, but this time, he knew he wouldn't leave. Not yet. The clearing fell into an uneasy stillness, broken only by the soft breaths of the mother bear and her injured cub. John stayed where he was, seated a safe distance from them, his back resting against a moss-covered log. Every muscle in his body was taut, poised for any sign of danger, but the mother bear remained calm, her massive form curled protectively around her cub. John's mind raced with questions. What more could he do? The cub's breathing was shallow, its tiny body trembling despite the bear's attempts to keep it warm. He thought about the first aid kit in his truck, parked miles away by the riverbank. It had supplies that could help, antiseptics, proper bandages, but the journey back would take time, and leaving them now felt unthinkable. He spoke softly, more to himself than to the bear. "You've got to give me a sign, big girl. Do I stay or do I go?" The bear lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. It was as though she understood his words, or at least the intent behind them. She didn't growl, didn't move to block his path. Instead, she lowered her head to nuzzle the cub, her movement slow and deliberate, as if telling him her choice had already been made. John took that as his answer. "I'll be back," he murmured, rising to his feet. His legs felt unsteady, his body reluctant to leave the clearing, but he knew it was the right decision. He glanced one last time at the pair before turning and retracing his steps through the forest. The bear didn't follow. She watched him go, her massive form a shadow in the dappled light. The hike back to the truck felt like an eternity. Every sound, every rustle of leaves sent his nerves sparking. His thoughts were a tangled mess of urgency and doubt. Was this even the right thing to do? What if the cub didn't survive while he was gone? What if the bear lost patience and left before he returned? He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. When he finally reached the riverbank, his truck was a welcome sight. He threw open the door and rummaged through the glove compartment until his fingers closed around the first aid kit. Grabbing a bottle of water and an old blanket from the back seat, he stuffed everything into his fishing bag and slung it over his shoulder. The journey back to the clearing was faster, urgency lending speed to his steps. His boots crunched over, fallen leaves and twigs, his eyes scanning the path ahead. When he reached the spot where he'd first seen the paw prints, he slowed, his heart pounding. What if they were gone? But they weren't. The bear and her cub were still there, the mother's enormous frame shielding the little one from the cool forest air. She raised her head as John approached, her body tense but not aggressive. He paused at the edge of the clearing, giving her a moment to assess him. When she didn't react, he moved forward, keeping his pace slow and deliberate. "I told you I'd be back," he said softly, dropping to his knees near the cub. He set the bag down and opened it, pulling out the supplies. The mother bear's nose twitched as she caught the scent of the antiseptic, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she didn't move. John worked quickly, cleaning the wound with careful precision. The cub let out a faint cry, its tiny body jerking slightly, and the mother bear rumbled low in her throat. John glanced up, meeting her gaze. "I know it hurts," he murmured, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "But I'm trying to help." The mother bear didn't growl again. She simply watched, her massive frame coiled like a spring, ready to act if necessary. John finished cleaning the wound and applied a fresh bandage, securing it tightly but gently. He wrapped the blanket around the cub, tucking it in snugly to keep it warm. When he was done, he sat back, his chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. The cub had quieted, its trembling less pronounced. It wasn't much, but it was progress. John looked up at the mother bear, his eyes searching hers. "Now it's up to you," he said softly. "That's all I can do." The bear shifted, her massive paw brushing against the cub as she adjusted her position. She sniffed at the bandage, her nose lingering for a moment before she let out a low, rumbling exhale. To John's astonishment, she seemed at ease. He didn't move. He didn't want to break the fragile trust they had built. Instead, he stayed where he was, leaning back against the log once more. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. Hours passed in silence, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint chirping of birds. For the first time in what felt like forever, John wasn't thinking about his own pain, his own loss. All that mattered was the fragile life lying before him and the bond he had forged with a creature he'd never thought he could understand. As night began to fall, he made his decision. He would stay as long as it took. The forest came alive as night descended, its nocturnal symphony filling the clearing with an eerie, calming harmony. Crickets chirped in rhythmic cadence, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. The mother bear remained motionless beside her cub, her massive form barely discernible in the fading light. John sat a short distance away, the flicker of his small flashlight casting soft beams over the scene. He shifted his position, his muscles aching from hours of stillness. The makeshift camp he had set up was rudimentary. A small fire pit he hadn't dared to light for fear of startling the bear, his fishing bag propped under his head for support. Despite the discomfort, he had no intention of leaving. Not until he knew they were safe. The cub let out a weak cry, breaking the quiet. The mother bear nuzzled it gently, her nose brushing against its bandaged side. John couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Was he prolonging the inevitable? The thought weighed heavily on him, but he shoved it aside. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to the cub's strength and the mother's unwavering care. The night deepened, the stars above shimmering through breaks in the forest canopy. John found his mind drifting, memories of his own loss surfacing unbidden. He thought of his daughter, the way her laughter used to fill their small home. Losing her had been a wound no bandage could mend, a pain he carried with him every day. He had come to this river to find solace, but instead it felt as though he had been given a purpose, however fleeting. The sound of movement pulled him from his thoughts. His flashlight beam swept across the clearing, landing on the mother bear. She was standing now, her body tense, her ears twitching as she listened to the forest around them. John's heart leapt into his throat. Something was out there. He turned off the flashlight, plunging the clearing into darkness. His eyes adjusted slowly, the faint silver glow of the moon offering just enough light to make out shapes. The mother bear rumbled low, a deep guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. From the shadows, a pair of yellow eyes glinted. John's breath hitched. A wolf. The predator stepped into the clearing, its lean body silhouetted. Against the moonlight, its gaze flicked between the mother bear and the cub, its posture low and predatory. The mother bear growled, a sound so fierce it seemed to shake the ground beneath John's feet. She rose to her full height, her massive frame a formidable shield. Between the wolf and her vulnerable cub, John's hand instinctively went to the knife strapped to his belt. He knew better than to interfere, but his pulse thundered in his ears as he watched the tense standoff. The wolf took a step closer, its lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. The mother bear roared, a sound that echoed through the forest like a thunderclap. The wolf froze, its ears flattening against its skull. For a moment, the clearing seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly the wolf backed away, its tail dipping low as it melted back into the shadows. The mother bear stayed on high alert, her body a coiled spring, until the faint rustling of the wolf's retreat faded entirely. John exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The encounter had lasted only moments, but it had felt like an eternity. The mother bear settled back down beside her cub, her growls tapering off into a quiet hum. She glanced briefly in John's direction, her eyes reflecting the faint light of the stars. There was no aggression in her gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement. "You're one tough mama," John whispered, his voice barely audible over the forest's gentle hum. He leaned back against the log, his body still trembling from the adrenaline. Despite the danger, he felt a deep sense of awe. Witnessing the bear's raw power and fierce devotion stirred something in him, a reminder of the lengths one would go to for those they loved. The hours stretched on, and the clearing fell into a fragile peace. The cub stirred occasionally, its soft cries muffled as it nestled closer to its mother. John watched over them, his exhaustion outweighed by the quiet determination to see this through. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber, John realized something profound. This wasn't just about saving the cub anymore. It was about connection, about finding a sliver of hope and humanity in the wildest, most unexpected of places. The mother bear rose slowly, her movements careful as she adjusted the cub against her side. John watched in silence as she turned, Toward the trees, the cub's small frame cradled in her powerful grip. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, looking back one last time. Their eyes met. In that moment, John felt an unspoken gratitude pass between them, a bond forged in trust, fear, and the unyielding will to protect life. He raised his hand. In a small wave, his chest tight with emotion as she disappeared into the forest, her cub safe in her care. John sat alone in the clearing, the morning light warming his skin. For the first time in what felt like years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever. Peace. The forest seemed quieter now, as if the world itself was catching its breath after the events of the past day. John sat in the clearing, his back resting against the mossy log. The sun climbed higher, its warmth cutting through the morning chill and painting the trees with golden light. He watched the spot where the mother bear had vanished, her powerful frame cradling the injured cub. Though they were gone, their presence lingered, a memory etched into the fabric of his mind. John exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping as the tension drained from his body. For the first time in what felt like forever, his mind wasn't consumed by his own grief. Instead, it was filled with the image of the bear and her cub, a testament to survival, resilience, and love in its purest form. He thought of the moment. Their eyes had met for the final time, the silent connection that had transcended every barrier between them. He rose slowly, his body stiff from a night spent in the forest. His fishing bag sat discarded nearby, the supplies inside barely touched. The river still whispered in the distance, its steady flow a comforting reminder of life's continuity. Picking up the bag, he began the trek back to the riverbank. As he walked, his mind wandered. The encounter with the bear had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt since before he'd lost his daughter. It was as if the encounter had stripped away the walls he'd built around his heart, forcing him to confront the raw, untamed beauty of life itself. When he reached the river, the sight of his truck felt oddly out of place, a piece of civilization amidst the wilderness that had felt like a different world. He placed his bag in the back seat and leaned against the door, his gaze drifting toward the forest. For a moment, he considered staying, spending another night by the river, hoping for another glimpse of the bear. But he knew better. Their story together had come to an end, and it was time for him to carry its lessons forward. Climbing into the truck, John started the engine, the low rumble breaking the morning silence. He pulled onto the narrow dirt road that wound through the woods, the scenery blurring as he drove. The events of the past day replayed in his mind. The desperation in the mother bear's eyes, the cub's fragile breathing, the unspoken trust that had bound them together. As the forest thinned and gave way to open fields, John felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The bear had taught him something profound, not through words, but through her actions, her trust, her courage. Life, he realized, was about more than just surviving the pain. It was about finding moments of connection, even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. It was about reaching out, even when fear held you back. By the time he reached the edge of town, the weight in his chest had shifted. The ache of loss was still there, but it felt lighter somehow, as if the bear and her cub had taken a piece of it with them. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a long moment, staring at the modest house that had once been filled with laughter. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the crushing emptiness that usually greeted him. Stepping out of the truck, he looked toward the distant mountains, their peaks still dusted with snow. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He thought of the cub, its small body cradled in its mother's jaws, and hoped, prayed that it would survive. As he opened the front door and stepped inside, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he was searching for. The mother bear had trusted him to do what was right, and in doing so, she had given him something he hadn't thought he would ever feel again: purpose. John placed the fishing bag on the kitchen table and turned to the window, the morning sun streaming through the glass. His mind lingered on the final words he'd spoken to the bear. "It's up to you now." But he realized those words weren't just for her. They were for himself as well. In the quiet of his home, John reflected on the experience and its deeper meaning. Life was unpredictable, wild, and often cruel, but it also offered moments of connection that could heal even the deepest wounds. The encounter with the bear had been one such moment, a reminder that compassion wasn't a weakness, it was strength in its purest form. He hoped others might see it too, to look at the world with a little less fear and a little more wonder, to act with kindness even when the outcome was uncertain, because sometimes the bravest choice wasn't to fight or flee, it was to trust,